Great. Thank you very much, Katie. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you to Julie and Troy and the whole One Climate Future team for the invitation and opportunity to come and present today. My name is Melissa Winne. I'm part of the External Affairs team at ISO New England. I do also believe one of my colleagues, Ruben Flores Marzan, who's a policy advisor for environmental and community affairs, is also on the call today, and so he'll be listening in as well, and you may see him at ISO events, so feel free to say hello if you see him out. So yes, today I would like to present on who ISO New England is, give some context around what's going on with the regional electricity grid. But before we get started, I'd love to just provide a little bit of background of who I am. So I've been with ISO New England for almost 3 years now, and on the external affairs team, I cover Maine. And so I stay really engaged in the work that's happening in Maine, keeping an eye at the state and the local levels, like what has been happening and what's been going on the last few years with Portland and South Portland on all of the climate work. And I'm available as a resource to help answer questions related to ISO New England. And so it's great to say hello to everyone today. Prior to this role, I did work in the Maine Governor's Energy Office. And in that role, I primarily focused on the legislature, but I did also work on the climate action plan work through the Maine Climate Council, and was really engaged with the first round of that climate action planning. And I know the second plan has been recently published. And before that, I was with E2 Tech. And so I spent a lot of time working in Maine prior to joining the ISO, and I'm really excited to stay engaged in the work of Maine. So with that, we'll get started with the slides. So as I mentioned today, I'll start with an overview of ISO New England, talk a little bit about how we were formed and how we're regulated, and the critical roles that we administer for the New England region. I'll give some context around the current power system and very briefly touch on the wholesale electricity markets. But then I think what's likely of most interest to this group is I'll talk a little bit about how the state's clean energy and climate policies have already impacted the system and the ways in which we're studying future impacts as the region transitions to more renewable energy and decarbonizing transportation and the heating sectors. We'll then move into talking about our role in system planning. And in particular, there's a recent item that is moving forward that has implications for Maine. And so I'll mention that and introduce that so folks that may not already be aware know that that's coming. And I believe we're going to hold questions till the end. But Katie, if you see anything, clarifying questions, feel free to interrupt and take them as we go. So who is ISO New England? So we were created in 1997, and this was at a time when the New England states were seeking to deregulate or restructure. And so what that means is there was interest in moving away from vertically integrated utilities and introducing more competition. And so that means opening access to the transmission system, removing obstacles to competition in the wholesale trade of electricity. And so at the federal level, Congress and FERC established these independent entities to accomplish those goals. And so we are the independent system operator for New England. So we operate across the 6 New England states. And we are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. I'm going to try to spell out any acronyms as we go, but as folks that are engaged in energy know, there are a lot of acronyms. But that is FERC. That's one you'll hear often when you are engaged in the ISO work. We also serve as the reliability coordinator for New England under the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. We are independent of the companies in the marketplace, and our markets are designed to be neutral on technology. And so I'll provide a little more context on our markets later on, but essentially what that means is we're not choosing resources based on the type of resource that they are, Rather, when we run our markets, we're choosing the next least cost resource that's available to meet the load on the system. And the three critical roles that we provide for New England include grid operation. So you can think about this a bit as kind of air traffic control for the high voltage transmission system. And so we don't own any of the infrastructure. We don't own poles and wires or generation, but we operate the grid to ensure that generation is meeting load 24/7, 365 throughout the year. And this is on the high voltage transmission system. So not the distribution lines that you may see running through your neighborhood. This is the higher voltage bulk power system. And I have a map to show you what that looks like for New England on a future slide. We also administer the wholesale electricity markets. And again, similar to our role with grid operation, for the most part, we're not purchasing power or selling power, but we administer the wholesale market platform for load serving entities like utilities to purchase electricity off of the market and for generators to sell onto the market. And our last role is power system planning. And we are required to forecast the needs for the system out to the next 10 years to ensure that we're able to reliably meet load in that 10-year time frame. And so we have a 10-year forecast that comes out annually. We also recently have been authorized to do longer term transmission studies, and I'll talk about that at the end of this presentation. But we have recently come out with a report that's looking out to 2035, 2040, and 2050 in terms of what the transmission system's needs will be throughout the clean energy transition in that time frame. We also study resources that are seeking to interconnect on the bulk power system through our interconnection queue. And essentially what that means is we are any resource that's looking to connect to the bulk power system, we study it to see what the impact is on the system as it exists currently and any resources that are participating on the system to ensure that there aren't any adverse reliability impacts and to quantify what the cost would be to upgrade any parts of the system that may be needed for those resources looking to provide power. So those three critical roles are essentially captured in our mission. Additionally, we have adopted a vision statement back in 2021 to recognize not only what we currently do, but where we're going moving forward. And so that statement is to harness the power of competition and advanced technologies to reliably plan and operate the grid as the region transitions to clean energy. And this was in recognition of the fact that most of the New England states have set really strong climate and clean energy policy requirements. And the ISO is here to help support that grid transition. And it's really come into play in the work that we're doing, including some of the study work that we've been engaged in alongside the New England states. So as I outline the things that we do where we have jurisdiction, I always find it helpful to be really clear about some of the things that we don't have the jurisdiction to do or that we don't do. The first one is we don't handle retail electricity. So I mentioned we administer the wholesale electricity markets. Those markets have an impact on what the retail rates are, but when you open your electricity bill at home from CMP or Versant or one of the COUs, that retail rate is actually regulated at the state level. And so there's a lot of components that go into the retail electricity. Can learn more about that through the Maine Public Utilities Commission or PUC, but we're operating at the wholesale electricity level, not the retail level. I mentioned before, but we also don't own any power grid infrastructure. So we don't own any poles and wires. We don't own generators on the system. We don't own any storage. We also don't have a stake in any of the companies that do own that infrastructure. And so this is to help us in our role as being an independent organization. Nobody that works at the ISO can have any financial stake in those companies. We also don't have jurisdiction over fuel infrastructure, and this often comes up in conversations around ensuring the grid is reliable through the winter season. So we don't have jurisdiction over things like natural gas pipelines or fuel storage tanks or anything on the fuel side. Our jurisdiction is over the bulk electric system. We also don't have any control over siting decisions. So siting and permitting is held at state, local, federal levels. That's not a role of the ISO. And all of this work that we do is not done in a silo. So I mentioned we're regulated by FERC. We serve as the reliability coordinator under NERC. ISO New England is a nonprofit organization, and so we are overseen by an independent board of directors. We engage in a number of open stakeholder opportunities. So at the bottom here, you can see that our comprehensive regional planning process happens through the Planning Advisory Committee, or PAC. And this is an ISO-run stakeholder group that's open to the public. So if you're really interested in some of the topics I'm talking about here, joining virtually to these PAC meetings is a great way to stay informed about the work that we're doing there. We do also have stakeholder groups through the New England Power Pool, or NEPOOL. And this is a advisory group that's made up of things like generators and transmission owners. Consumer advocates in each of the states often participate through the NEPOOL process. And any changes to the way in which our markets are run or our planning is done work through this NEPOOL stakeholder process and then eventually make their way to FERC, who has the ultimate kind of ability to regulate and approve or reject any of these proposals. And then that last column is really where my work is focused, the external affairs team is focused, is our engagement with the New England states. And so two groups that I want to highlight are the New England States Committee on Electricity, or NESCO. And this is a group of individuals that are appointed by the governors in each of the New England states, and they are really actively engaged in the work of the ISO at the regional level. And the other is the New England Conference on Public Utility Commissioners, or NECPUC. And this is a group of the commissioners and regulators in each of the New England states that engage through this other group. And in addition to that, we work really closely with energy offices. So in Maine, we're working with the governor's energy office to help be a technical resource on the work that they're doing. The Maine PUC, the Office of the Public Advocate, environmental regulators, and even local sustainability groups like what's happening in Portland and South Portland. We're available to help answer questions as you're working through the work that you're doing. Oh, and we do also engage with the legislators as they're working through the legislative process as well. So moving on to some context of the actual physical electric grid. So we are part of what is known as the Eastern Interconnection, and this is East Coast over towards the Rockies down to Florida. You can see this orange shaded area. There's two other interconnections in the US, the Western Interconnection, and then Texas is its own through ERCOT. And the importance of the fact that we are interconnected through this Eastern Interconnection is that anything that's happening on the system in this orange shaded area can have impacts to the rest of the system. And so back in 2003, there was an issue that occurred in the Midwest that led to blackouts throughout the Northeast. Luckily, New England was largely spared, but it did initiate some additional mandatory reliability standards and requirements, including for the ISO, to plan and operate the system to ensure that contingencies happening throughout the Eastern Interconnection don't result in blackouts here in New England. And zooming into the New England system specifically, so this looks a little bit like the highway system. I think about it a little bit that way, but this is looking at the bulk power system. And the dark blue line is the 345 kV lines, which essentially are just the highest voltage lines on this system. And that is where the bulk of the power is transferred throughout New England. You can think about that maybe like the I-95 corridor. We do also have 13 ties to our neighboring regions, and we do import, last year it was about 9% of the energy needs are met by imports out, so power coming into New England from outside of these states. And as a region, we've invested about $12 billion in investments for reliability over the last 2 decades or so. And these have been costs shared by the region to help ensure that the system is reliable throughout all the reaches of where you see the transmission infrastructure. And we are seeing additional requests for transmission to be developed to provide opportunities for renewable energy development to provide power onto the system as well. So in addition to just those reliability needs, there's other investments happening to this system. And we are currently a summer peaking system, meaning that our highest electricity usage comes in the summer season. And that was a shift from around the early 1990s when we were previously a winter peaking system. And the shift to summer has primarily happened because of the growth of air conditioning and a decline in electric heating during that time period. We do expect that we'll be shifting back to a winter peaking system as folks are passing policies and incentives to electrify heating demand. So especially in Maine, there's a lot of heat pumps that folks are adopting, and that's really changing what we're seeing for electricity usage in the winter season. And this slide is some data from that longer term study that I mentioned, the 2050 transmission study. And again, this was looking at what the system needs would be out to 2035, 2040, and 2050 under assumptions for the New England states to meet their climate and clean energy goals. So this includes load growth from EV and heat pump adoption. And you can see here in 2023, we have the yellow bars on the left are the summer peaks and the blue bars are the winter peaks. And this demonstrates currently we're that summer peaking system, but you can see as we're looking out to the mid 2030s and beyond, an anticipated shift to that winter peaking system. The other key point to highlight here is those dashed lines represent our all-time system peak in the yellow dashed line, and then our all-time winter peak for blue. So the all-time peak, the most electricity that's been drawn on the system is 28 gigawatts. And when we're looking at the winter peak out to 2050, we're seeing over double that all-time system peak. And so a significant amount of load growth. And if at the same time the states are also meeting their clean energy requirements, it means that we're going to need quite a lot more renewable energy generation on the system in order to meet that load requirement. And again, this is a forecast, but it gives a sense of the direction that we anticipate New England moving in. And currently on our system, this gives some information about the amount and type of generation that we have providing power. What I want to highlight here is that in addition to just resources that are generating electrons to the grid, we do also have demand resources that participate in our markets. And so that means like energy efficiency, energy efficient resources, in addition to entities that may say, okay, when you need more power on the grid, rather than generating more electricity, I'm willing to reduce my load in order to reduce what's required on the system. And so those participate in our markets in a similar way as a resource that is generating power. I'm going to touch very quickly on markets, in part because there are some proposed changes working through the system on one of these markets, but we administer 3 markets. The first is the energy market, and this is really the trade of actual electricity production for the most part. There is a slight forward market in the fact that there's a day ahead component of this. But the real-time energy markets is the actual market for resources that are providing power in real time to meet load. We do have a small ancillary services market, and I say small just in terms of the quantity of dollars that are traded through this market, but it's a very important component of the markets in that they provide what we call short-term reliability services. So engineers can explain this much better than I can, but essentially these are resources that can help regulate the frequency and support voltage on the system to ensure that we are meeting reliable services in the shorter term. And they're really critical, particularly when there's really high demand on the system or we're experiencing an emergency, maybe a transmission line that's very important suddenly goes out and we need to make sure that we're still maintaining those reliability requirements on the system. This last market, the forward capacity market, is the one that is currently undergoing some proposed changes. So typically what this market has provided is a way for the ISO to ensure that we have the necessary capacity, the necessary resources on the system 3 years out. And so the auction would run and resources would commit to being available 3 years into the future. But as we're seeing this transition to more renewable generation, that 4-year timeframe was primarily for the benefit of larger fossil fuel resources that needed that time to build their facility and have that financial commitment. And so what they're looking at is a shift to what we call prompt or seasonal, so shorter time frame forward markets. So that's currently in the works. That's expected to continue on through probably 2027. If you're interested in that, there's materials on our website, but I didn't want to spend too much time explaining something that is very likely going to change moving forward. And if you're interested, that project's called the Capacity Auction Reform Key Project. And if you need any help finding materials on our website, I'm happy to help with that. So this is what I assume most folks are interested in terms of the work as relates to One Climate Future. This isn't news to anyone on this call, I'm sure, but the New England states, for the most part, have been moving forward with really strong climate and clean energy goals. So we have 5 of the 6 New England states have requirements for a reduction of emissions of 80% by 2050. The state that's missing from that list is New Hampshire. And then in purple, you can see Maine specifically. So there's a renewable energy goal of 100% by 2050. There's a requirement in statute to be carbon neutral by 2045. I want to also acknowledge it's not on this slide, but the governor does have the goal of 100% by 2040. And the Maine Governor's Energy Office has come out with a report to really focus on what it would take to get to that goal. So that's also something we are aware of that's just not on the slide currently. But these policies are all already having an impact on the system, and we expect it to continue to have an impact moving forward. And we've been working really closely with the New England states to study that impact and help provide information for policymakers and others to make decisions to prepare the system for that transition. So one of the impacts that we've seen already is the retirement of primarily coal, oil, and nuclear resources. So since about 2013, we've seen around 7,000 megawatts of these types of generators retiring from the system. And we've seen announcements of plans for retirement for another about 750 megawatts of generation. And historically, these types of resources have played an important role, particularly in the winter season when the natural gas supplies are really constrained in New England. These resources can provide valuable generation onto the system. And so as we're moving forward, as a region moving towards this clean energy transition, it's important that there are resources available that can provide these types of services to make sure that even on a really cold stretch, you're able to turn your lights on and cook and heat your homes and all of that. So this chart is showing on the left side, the darker blue bar is the year 2000. The middle teal color bar is 2024. And the bar on the right is part of the study work that we've done looking out to 2040. And so this is electric energy production, so actual output of electricity, and the types of resources that are providing that electricity. Of note, you can see from 2000 to 2024 that reduction in oil and coal. So they were providing 18 and 14% of our electricity to meet load, and we're now down below a percentage in terms of how much they're actually generating. What has primarily replaced those resources is natural gas. And so this was 2024, we had over half of our load met by natural gas electricity production. And then as you're looking out to 2040, so again, this is, assuming that we've met climate and clean energy goals as a region, that green bar all the way over on the right is 56% coming from renewables. So again, not only are we seeing a need for a larger amount of renewable energy production, but this is also at a time when that load is really increasing. And so it's quite, we've seen quite a shift over the last couple decades from coal and oil to natural gas. And I think we're at a pivot point here where we're starting to see this shift away from fossil fuels into greater renewable energy production on the system. One of the impacts of coal and oil being reduced is a reduction, particularly in sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. So this is looking at 2010 out to 2023. You can see these emission reductions. We have also seen a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, though I recognize that if we're meeting state clean energy goals, we're going to need to do more as a region to continue to reduce carbon emissions. And when I say we, I mean, the states collectively. The ISO is not necessarily driving these. This is being driven by state policies. This information comes from a report that we published called the New England Electric Generators Air Emissions Report. And if you're interested in learning more about what goes into this, we are holding a public webinar on March 13th. You can register on our website. We've been holding additional public webinars over the last couple years to help provide an explanation of some of the technical study work that we've done. So recordings of those are also on our website, but this is one that we have coming up that may be of interest. So I mentioned that natural gas provides over half of our production on the system. And one of the results of that is natural gas is often the resource that is setting the price in the wholesale electricity markets. Say it's the marginal resource. And so what we see is that natural gas prices are really closely tied to wholesale electricity prices. And so when there is peaks in natural gas prices, and that can occur on a really cold winter season, or as we've seen recently, global events can have an impact on natural gas and liquefied natural gas or LNG prices. And when there are spikes in natural gas, that's the dark blue line on this chart, we see a corresponding spike in wholesale electricity prices as well. I mentioned earlier that we study resources looking to connect to our system through our interconnection queue. And this slide is showing data for the types of resources that we're seeing in the queue. And the smaller chart on the left side is from June 2017. And you can see that it was split, but the majority of the resources seeking to interconnect were natural gas. And this can also be natural gas facilities that we're looking to expand and provide greater production, and wind. And as of January of this month, you can see that the majority of those resources looking to interconnect are wind, battery storage, and solar. And again, this is really driven by state policies. The other important note here is the quantity of resources. So back in 2017, we had about 13,000 megawatts, and we are now looking at almost a tripling of that, around 38,000 megawatts. Not all of these projects will be built. There's a number of reasons why outside of the ISO process, citing financing, that they may not be built, or there could be resources putting in a couple different requests with variations on where they interconnect to compare. But it does give a good indication of the types of resources, and just that there are a lot that are looking to generate on the system. And of that wind, a lot of it is offshore wind down in the southern New England coastline currently, but we do have resources looking to interconnect onshore in Maine. And this is that same queue, but it's breaking down all of the resources by state. So I wanted to include that in case folks were interested. And in order for all of these resources to interconnect, there's a need for transmission in order to provide power to load centers. And so we do also see what we call elective transmission upgrades, or ETUs, in our queue for transmission lines to deliver power. Just looking at time, I'm going to move through a couple of these, but I'll have the slides available and they have links if you want more information. But I wanted to note that the 10-year forecast that I mentioned earlier that the ISO creates comes out annually, typically in the May timeframe. It's called our Capacity, Energy Loads, and Transmission, or CELT report. And it's used throughout a number of ISO studies as we're looking at what the forecasted load will be on the system. And historically, from around 1995 to 2005, we saw an increase in load during that time frame that was driven, again, by the adoption of electric air conditioning, as well as economic growth. And then over the last couple decades, we've really seen the load decrease. And that was driven by policies really supporting energy efficiency measures and behind the meter, smaller solar production. But again, we are forecasting a pretty significant growth moving forward as we see more electric vehicles and heat pumps come onto the system. And these slides are providing some additional details about the CELT forecast, so I'll leave these as reference if you're interested. And all of this work we've kind of put into the context of this theme of 4 pillars. So there are 4 primary needs that need to happen for the clean energy transition to be successful. So we've talked about the need for greater clean energy on the system. We need to ensure that we have resources that can maintain balance. So if you have, all solar, for example, solar's providing generation when the sun is shining. Do we have resources available like storage and other technologies that can ensure we're balancing supply with load? Do we have resources on the system that can provide power through, say, an extended cold stretch in the winter, or if energy supplies are constrained? So we call that energy adequacy. And then again, we're going to need a robust transmission system as a region in order to provide that power to load centers. And this is the last kind of more specific item, but that I wanted to ensure folks were aware of, is our longer term transmission planning process. And so this work stemmed from a request from NESCO, so all 6 New England states, in a vision statement that essentially recommended the ISO work to provide these longer term transmission studies. Like 10 years load forecast is helpful, but as we're doing our planning and our policy work, it would be beneficial to have a look out further to be in that longer term time frame. And so the first report that we provided is the 2050 transmission study. We also created a 2-page fact sheet on that. So if you're looking to just pull some of the high level key takeaways, that's a really great resource to look at. And following the creation of this study, the publication of this study, there's a kind of a second phase of this work, which was to implement a process for the New England states to ask the ISO to put out a request for proposals or an RFP to address needs that were identified in this longer term study. And so we received a formal request from NESCO in December of last year to address a number of needs in connection to that 2050 transmission study. And the reason in particular I wanted to mention it is that the needs that were identified were in Maine. And so they're looking to address some transmission interfaces where there is a lot of power, either currently kind of being constrained or with the addition of onshore wind in Maine would be constrained. And so that includes an interface kind of in the southern area of Maine, also to get power out through Maine, New Hampshire, and accommodate additional interconnection of onshore wind. So again, this is a request that comes from the states, but the ISO is responding and working to get that RFP out. Our current tentative schedule is to have that out next month, so in March. And then there's links to a few other resources that we put out that include data about the power grid, a resource that we provide, the Regional Electricity Outlook. They're all linked here. They're great to look at if you'd like to take a deeper dive. I also wanted to mention that I mentioned the Planning Advisory Committee is one way to tune in to the work that we're doing. Another is the Consumer Liaison Group, the CLG. So this was created as a forum for information sharing between the ISO and consumers in New England. And the meetings are free and open to the public. You can attend either in person or virtually. And each year they move around different states. And so this is a list of the dates and the locations for the meetings in 2025. We were in South Portland, I think last year or the year before. So these meetings do sometimes come to Maine depending on the rotation for that year. But this is another great opportunity to engage in the work of the ISO and get updates on what we're doing. And this is my last slide, but this is an app that I really enjoy using. It's called ISO to Go. You can download it for free on your phone, and it provides information about real-time prices, exactly what the resource mix is at any given time providing power on the system. You can see estimated emissions based on that resource mix. So it's really fascinating, particularly on a week that's really cold and we're seeing some changes in the kind of typical resource mix. So if you need any help finding or downloading that, I'd be happy to help with that. And we do also have what we call the ISO Newswire. And this is, they put out articles. You can sign up to get a monthly update of the articles that have gone out. And it's a really accessible way to read kind of, again, what we're working on and some of the major happenings. I find it to be a really useful resource. So again, if you need any help finding these on our website, feel free to reach out. And with that, I will pause and see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I think that was such a great overview of something that most people don't think about every day. But it's such an important organization for so many levels of electricity. And thank you for providing, I think, a lot of ways that people can engage with this work. A call to action or just opportunities for engagement is always helpful. And I'm opening the floor for questions. Yeah, go Julie.
All right, I'm sure that there's a lot of questions from people, but I would love to kick it off. Melissa, can you go back to the slide where it was like all the different groups and committees and all of that? Because it seems like there not only is electricity, not only is electricity so complicated, but there's a lot of moving parts just on the players in the system. And I really have two questions. I don't want to take up time if other people do, but my first question is, really, how do all of these interact, or do they interact well? And first of all, it was a really good presentation. It just covered so much, and it sounds as if from this presentation, everything is just like moving along smoothly. And I'm sure that there are challenges. And so I would love to hear more about, like, what are the challenges that you're facing, and that we're all facing.
Yeah, thanks, Julie, for the question. Yeah, the energy industry, the sector as a whole is all very complicated. And we're just looking at, electricity. You have a lot of, the fuel interactions and what's happening with, heating oil and natural gas is all really important to the sector as a whole as well. I'd say in terms of how all of these entities interact, there's a few different components. So I mentioned the knee pool process. Consumer advocates in particular are a group that engage through a number of different ways. So for folks that don't know, in Maine, it's the Office of the Public Advocate, and they are really created to serve as a voice for the consumers in the state and the region. And so they often engage through the knee pool process and also a number of larger state processes. Not everyone that is part of these groups always agree on the outcome of the work that's happening or the change that's being proposed. And so I think in some ways that's a good thing. It provides a lot of opportunity for differing voices to offer their thoughts and further refine kind of any changes that we're making to our system. In terms of knee pool in particular, issues start through a technical committee, so either markets, reliability, and transmission. And these really are deep dives into the work that's happening, and they provide a recommendation up to the participants committee, who further debate and vote before it goes to FERC. And then there's opportunities for engagement through the FERC process to file comments or whatnot. So I think each layer kind of provides an opportunity for different voices to provide their opinion and refine proposals. And then, ultimately it'll go to FERC, and there's processes there for folks to engage. I think on the state side, and maybe this gets into your second question of what some challenges are, we are a regional transmission organization. And so we are operating across 6 New England states, and the 6 states don't always agree exactly on the direction that we're moving as a region or the policies that they're working on within their state. And so I think that provides some challenges that maybe are different from an ISO like the New York ISO that works within one state. But I think that's where it's really important for these types of opportunities to come and present, for information sharing, for all of the work that we're doing to be accessible to folks, so that, we in this independent role across New England can at least help to play a part in being that technical resource and, using platforms like the CLG to bring folks together to talk about these really important regional issues. So hopefully that gets to the question, but it's exciting work. I think what we're doing as a region is really important, so it's great to be engaged in it.
Thank you. I see, Natalie, you have your hand up.
Yes, thanks. A very good presentation. I really appreciate it and appreciate being here today. I like your app a lot, and I usually look at the design curve. And what I just wanted to ask you about, it shows actual with estimated behind the meter solar. And can you just talk to me a little bit about that? I keep an eye on that because I think it's really, what I'm assuming that, well, you can explain to me what it is, and so I don't make assumptions, and then just understand it a little bit better.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and I skipped over a slide that talked a little bit about it, but I'll come back to it now. So from the wholesale transmission, the bulk power system, the transmission system level, we don't have direct insight to, we'll say, like a rooftop solar is one example, right? So if you have solar on your house and you in midday are drawing power from your solar panels, you're not drawing load from the grid, right? You're not needing power from the grid. And so the way that we see that at the transmission level is actually a load reduction. And so the slide that I just brought up is showing kind of the impact of these types of behind the meter solar production on the system. So the dotted line would be demand without these resources. And the solid line is the demand that we're actually seeing. And so on a day where it's really sunny and solar is producing a lot, we view that again as load reduction. And so you're seeing the load drop on that sunny afternoon as the solar's producing. And then as the sun starts to set and folks are heading home and cooking and turning lights on, you see that load kind of peak up again in the evening. And so we call these the duck curve. You can kind of see like the outline of the back of a duck, but essentially what we're showing is these solar resources reducing demand on the system. And so the app shows both kind of what we're estimating for this behind the meter solar that we don't have kind of direct visibility in, and then what the load would be if that solar wasn't producing. And we actually, I think I linked, yeah, there's an article at the bottom here that talks a bit more about the duck curve phenomenon and how often we're seeing that on the system, because the number of these days as solar is increased, we're seeing a lot more of this kind of lower demand during the day than we're actually seeing in the overnight time frame.
Thank you, Melissa. And yeah, I really appreciate the fact that you can share these slides after. I think everybody will, also really appreciate that. I have a question. Can you go to the slide where it showed the resources that are being used on the grid? I think it was 20, or now and into the future. I can't remember. There were 3 different years. Yeah. My question is, I see that going into the future, hydro and nuclear are going to decrease. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes. So I know this for the nuclear, and I believe this is true for hydro in this analysis as well. So we're seeing the percentage of load being met by these resources reducing, and that is because of the growth of the load in those years. So for nuclear, if the megawatt generation actually stays the same, we're seeing that reduction in the percentage of power provided. And I believe that is also true for hydro. And I should note too, this study was done in close coordination with the New England states, and the assumptions that went into it in terms of kind of the resource mix actually came out of a Massachusetts study. And so this isn't saying that this is how the ISO thinks 2040 should look, or this was really a forecast of how state policies are impacting supply on the system. But yeah, that's why you're seeing that reduction in the percentage. It's a great question.
That totally makes sense. Thank you.
Can I follow up on that? That was a really good question. So state policies change. I don't know how often you change, how often you update your long-term planning based on state policies. And I know the market is clearly going towards renewables, but politics may be shifting at different levels. And so are you just going on current state goals? Are you trying to sort of hedge where the market's going and the effect politics might have?
Yeah, this is a tough question. I'll say we are very closely monitoring everything that's happening both at the state and the federal levels. And to answer your first question, so in terms of how often we're updating these forecasts, so the 10-year SELT forecast that I mentioned, we update annually. In terms of these longer term transmission studies that we've done, like the 2050 transmission study, this was the first one that we've completed. We do now have authority in our tariff, so the set of rules that we operate under, to do additional long-term transmission studies, again, at the request of the states. And so, we're currently working through that second phase where we're issuing an RFP at the request of the states. But there are ways in which we could be asked to initiate another long-term transmission study with updated assumptions included. And so that is something we're able to continue doing moving forward. The SELT forecast, we work really closely with our state partners to understand what policies are implemented that are particularly driving load growth. So, incentives for EVs and heat pumps. And we do take into account how those resources, how much adoption has occurred in the previous years. And, if we're seeing that we're really over forecasting and that hasn't been coming, true, we may discount our forecast slightly in order to offer a more tangible, realistic forecast. But it is a tricky process to go through, and that team is constantly updating their methodology as well to make sure that they're kind of forecasting as accurately as they can. But we do take into account any changes that are happening in the markets or in the policy realm in terms of how much we anticipate adoption of EV and heat pumps occurring. We also have solar and some other components in that forecast as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody have any other questions?
I have a question. I can't figure out how to raise my hand, so if you don't mind, I'll jump in.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could speak at a high level to the difference between interconnecting with ISO New England and the interconnection process with the specific like T&D utility that project would, like the service territory that project would be in.
Yes, and I will speak at a very high level. I'm not an engineer, so I can talk to the processes, but there are some nuances even within this explanation. But if you are a resource that is either a smaller resource, like under 5 megawatts, or connecting to the distribution system, you're working through this interconnection process, as you mentioned, through your utility. If you are a larger resource connecting to the transmission system, or as we've seen more recently, if you are a grouping of smaller, under 5 megawatt solar projects, for example, that the utility identifies as potentially having implications and impact on the larger transmission system, you may also need to be studied through our interconnection study process. And again, what we're looking at is the impacts to the existing system and resources on the system to identify if you can interconnect reliably without those adverse impacts, and if there are any upgrades that you may be required to pay for in order to interconnect. So there are some resources that go through both interconnection processes, or you can generally say if you're a larger resource, you're likely working through the ISO interconnection process as well.
Thanks, Melissa. That was super helpful.
That was a great question. And if other people, I'm going to pause for a second. I have a follow-up, but if other people are having a hard time raising their hand, I don't want to keep jumping in. So jump in if you have a question.
I think go for
Okay,
it,
great.
Julie. Yeah.
All right, that is a really good question. So I don't know how much you can answer this, but there's so much solar that's been built in Maine over the past few years, and we have our net energy billing program, and like increasingly people are opposing it, and there's always rumblings of wanting to do away with the net energy billing program, and even if they don't, in 20 years it'll it'll phase out unless the legislature develops some new program. So like, what would happen to all of these like 5 megawatt and under really small scale generation solar arrays, how would ISO deal with that? It's super hypothetical, but like, what would happen?
You mean if the like state level incentives disappeared and those projects weren't developed?
Right. So if they're developed and for some reason, you know, is there a bill? I think the energy and utilities, there might be some bill. I haven't read it yet, but to sort of look at either reshaping it or there's people that always want to do away with it. So if you are generating solar and you own the array and you're putting it out on the grid, but there's no net energy billing program, how would it interact and how would you get compensated for the energy you're putting out on the grid?
Yeah, so there are opportunities for resources to participate in our markets. And so from an ISO level, if the resource is participating in the markets, that's, you know, a revenue stream for them. I can't really speak to like the financial models that some of these developers are working through. So, you know, there may be instances where if they're not receiving those kinds of state, you know, I don't know if incentives even the right word for something like net energy billing, but, you know, payments through state programs, that would be more a question for the developers around whether or not they're able to continue to function without that type of a program. But that's not really something that I can speak to. From our perspective, you know, if the resource is seeking to interconnect, if they're in the queue, we'll study them, and then, you know, they kind of have their own process of identifying how and which markets they may want to participate in, depending on their sizing and, you know, whether they meet the necessary requirements.
Yeah, thanks. It was you know, a really far out question. I just thought I'd ask, but looks like Sarah has a question.
Yeah, go for it, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. This was so helpful. So I appreciate you being here and talking to us. I have a question about interconnection queues. So I know that interconnection queues are a huge problem for renewables getting online, both the way that it occurs, as well as, you know, cost allocation, the time it takes. And I know that at the ISO level, you all are working on reforms and cluster study reforms under Order 2023. But I'm curious. It's kind of a multi-part question, but one, I know FERC is holding on to ISO's proposal. And so, you know, I'm curious what ISO is going to do as it waits. And if there's anything that can be done at the ISO level to reform interconnection process and the interconnection queues with and without FERC approval.
Yeah, it's a good question. So for folks that may not be aware, FERC issued an order number 2023 for interconnection queue reform for all ISOs. And so we worked through our stakeholder process and filed a compliance filing, and we are still waiting for a response from FERC. And the types of changes that we're talking about are intended to kind of help speed up the queue process, and also to move from kind of studying resources serially to studying kind of the first ready, first served model. I will say that from the ISO level, we have made some changes even prior to Order 2023 to allow for the study of clusters of resources if they meet certain requirements. And so for Maine, you can look at some of our Maine resource integration studies as an example of something that's kind of been done already. I can follow up with you and share some of the more recent presentations that have been made about kind of what we're doing while we're waiting for that compliance filing from FERC in terms of how our queue is currently operating. But beyond that, there's not much I can provide. You know, we're hoping for something coming from FERC soon. Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't speak necessarily to the specifics, but I can point you to a presentation that talks about kind of the hold on the queue and what projects either can't be studied or are continuing to be studied.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much.
I think the next question comes from Kate, and I think that'll be the last one we take.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn my video off because I'm traveling by train and the signal width is probably limited. But my question relates to on the down more at the local level in emergency response planning. We think about establishing microgrids so that parts of areas can operate even when the rest of the grid is down. How does that type of system, if at all, interact with ISO and its planning processes?
Yeah, it's another good question. I think it's a little bit hard to answer without knowing the specifics of the type of microgrid that you're talking about, right? Like there's a lot of different models. There are kind of microgrids that may really be like trading mechanisms for sharing recs, right? But maybe is still connected to the larger system versus a microgrid that could like island if there was an issue with the larger system. I think generally we would continue to work with the utilities in which that, you know, potential microgrid is located.
Ladies and gentlemen, kindly may I have your attention, please? Your friend Lab.
And you know, ensure that we're still able to operate the grid from our perspective in a reliable way. But yeah, I think without kind of the specifics of exactly what that would look like, it's hard for me to respond more than that. But yeah, we would work with the utility and understand how the microgrid would operate and kind of what would trigger it, islanding or whatever the case may be.
I think we're gonna wrap things up. Melissa, you are astounding. I think that was such a great presentation, and yeah, just questions from all across the board. It's certainly a complicated subject, so yeah, I really appreciate you doing everything this morning and taking the time to be with us. We will send out a follow-up email to everybody who registered, so that's well over 100 folks. Thank you so much, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you again for the invite and for everyone being engaged in your great questions. You know, again, it's if including that microgrid question, if you have follow-up or are looking for more detail, I'm happy to help serve as a liaison to our kind of engineering and technical experts to help provide additional context on anything. My contact information I'll share when I share the slides, and you can also find our full team on the website. So thank you again for the invite. This was great. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Great.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thank you everyone for joining us too. Happy Valentine's Day. Happy Friday. Bye.